I have some good news for you. This review only has 12 terms. See, that's not so bad. We can all hang with a dozen. And the first of these dozen terms is a real AP term, Potosi. And the reason I call it a heavy AP term, it shows up on my teacher AP guides quite a bit, and I never mention it in my regular world history. Potosi was a city in the Andes Mountains. And a quick refresher, the people of the Andes in South America were the Inca. As I move north, the people of Central America were the Maya, and as I move into modern Mexico, the people were the Aztec. And you put them all together, they're known as the Mesoamerican people. And they were very established, very civilized, had a lot going for them, and it got decimated when the Spanish arrived. Now, in terms of Potosi, Potosi had a silver mine, and tons of people moved there to chase that money, and it became the largest, most populated city in the Americas. So, what are the 2 points? Why are we learning about this old city? Number one, it has to do with migration. Why do people move? Push migrations, pull migrations. Give you a parallel. Detroit, Michigan, our town. People didn't move here because of the pleasant weather and the friendly people. People moved here for economic opportunity. If you ask why so many people are living in Detroit, why did people go to Potosi? That's where the silver mine was. That's where the money was. And I think it also makes a point that the Mesoamerican people had a civilization that was very advanced, very involved, and they lost a lot when the Spanish arrived. Okay, so that was the first of the 12 terms. Now, I know you know the term soft gold from a couple chapters ago, learning about Russia. Now, bear in mind, certain commodities become huge in certain time periods. Now, in this time period of history, fur was where it's at, and it allowed some groups of people to become very, very profitable, very wealthy. Now, a little closer to home than Russia, if you look at the Great Lakes, Michigan, Canada, the beaver was a huge commodity to the point they almost went extinct, okay, because it was such a profitable animal. So, fur trade, soft gold, one of the commodities that made the world go round during this time. Now, this word diaspora, if you don't know what the word diaspora means, it means you get removed from your homeland, but wherever you travel, you keep your culture. Oftentimes, you see it at weddings and at funerals and at holidays. And some people have these rituals around those three things, and they don't know why they're doing it. It's because it's a vestige of a past culture wherever they spread. So if you look at West Africa, West Africans got taken all over the Americas. Now, this diaspora continued for 400 years and a little closer to home. If you know African American people, there are certain customs that are West African. There are certain food items that people eat that are West African. So, again, diaspora. You get removed from the homeland, but you keep your culture. Now, some diasporas are push, some are pull. Now, in the West African case, clearly in the form of enslavement, that is a push. That was not a, positive incentive sort of thing. But we see West Africans spreading all throughout the Americas. Okay. Now, this when they got here, they formed these maroon societies or palmares. Now, the maroon people were ex-slaves that escaped their their masters and settled to establish their own autonomy. So, I think why we learn about the maroon societies is that we see these former enslaved people fighting for their own autonomy, fighting for their own rights. And personally, I'm of the belief you can only oppress people for so long. They will rise up in time. And what happens is that these maroon societies become larger in numbers and it shows empowerment for African people. But on the other side of it, it also made European powers quite alarmed, as you can imagine. Okay? Now, señores were African women who entered into marital unions, okay, with European merchants. And they essentially understood that by aligning themselves with these men, they can advance because these are people who have access to, they finally have access to wealth. However, you can see how it is sociologically challenging because you have this very racist notion of social Darwinism, yet you have these European men taking on African women. It's sociologically problematic, but you see these tough choices. Do I try to advance myself by the only means I can, or does that make me a sellout? Or you can figure this out. It opens up a whole can of worms, and we talked about that in class a little bit. So anyway, that's Signares. Now, Benin and Dahomey, these were African kingdoms, and again, maybe my biggest pet peeve is when people call Africa a country, which is absurd. There is no more diverse place on planet Earth in terms of culture and language and geography than the continent of Africa. And I think the point of having these two groups shows how different they are. So Benin had a limited slave trade, whereas Dahomey became very wealthy by selling slaves and taking advantage of the slave trade. And this West African slave trade started off with one African group enslaving another African group and then trading them to the Portuguese or whomever for commodities like guns and whatnot. And you see the diversity just here in West Africa. And that remains today. And here's just a way fast forward in time. When imperialism happened in the 20th century and Europeans drew fairly arbitrary political lines to show a country's boundary, they didn't give a lot of thought to the people who were in there. And they were putting people who were very disparate in the same country, which caused some troubles. Okay, so hopefully you got the point that some African empires benefited from the slave trade, some did not, but they were quite different, I think is the main point. So we've talked about the Silk Road, okay? We've talked about the Trans-Saharan trade route. Now, if you look at the Indian Ocean Trade Network, this is the other one, and you can see during this time period in history, it went, into overdrive, and it was very active. And these stops along the Indian Ocean Trade Network became hugely important places for commerce and culture and religion and that sort of thing, okay? And I know there's a little reiteration, and again, as you're taking this class and you see certain terms reiterated time and time again, those are the ones you probably need to dig into because they're probably going to be emphasized on your test come May. Trading post empires, like I mentioned a minute ago, these stops on the Indian Ocean Trade Network became the main. It's where the action was. It's where the money was flowing. That's where the culture was flowing. And it's not that different than today. If you look at the world of today, a lot of coastal cities are hugely important because of the ports and the commerce and the ability to get there. So trading post empires became, you can see these little dots, they became the trading post empires. And the country that ran them really fortified those, put emphasis into keeping those vibrant and flowing, the money flowing. So the Philippines now is, the Philippines I think was an example of the importance of certain places on the Indian Ocean trade route. If you look at the history of the Philippines have had people coming and going. It's a very desirable place to be geographically, and that's why a lot of people have been showing up there for centuries and centuries. So I think the Philippines, it's more an example how certain places are geographically really important on the Indian Ocean Trade Network, more so than the details of Philippine history, which is tough, which is a series of people showing up and leaving, a new group showing up and leaving, and it's been going on for a long time. A lot of cultures have diffused into the Philippines, safe to say. Now, the British and Dutch East India companies, some of these companies that were working the Indian Ocean Trade Network, working those trading posts, became stupid wealthy, like crazy wealthy. If you look at the corporations, these are the biggest companies ever, ever. Here's the Dutch East India Company. Okay, there's Microsoft and there's Apple. Okay, does that give you a perspective? Money that is borderline incomprehensible. So for those who were working the trade routes and those who were controlling the trade routes, they made money, and these countries are still wealthy today from the money they made centuries ago. So it's a lot of dough, in other words. Now, the silver drain, this is when all the money of Europe got invested into luxury goods, and this led to an abundance of silver in Asia and other parts of the world. So economies need to be in balance, and when the silver drain happened, it kind of threw a monkey wrench into things. So it how can I put this? It puts an emphasis on having solid banking systems and having economic transactions and having some sense of global economy, because it's quite fragile and that balance can be disrupted fairly easy. Okay. Piece of eight, real AP term. That was a standard Spanish coin that became the medium of exchange, and it was really the first global currency. And in economics class, you learn, how certain currencies, they rise, they fall, they become important. You take the euro in Europe as a piece of currency. Currency is important. I'm not going to give you a full bore economic uh, lesson here or lecture here, but piece of eight is the first global currency. So this is a precursor to modern banking, modern trade, and that kind of thing. Okay. So that's it. Those were the 12 from the chapter. Hopefully they were doable for you, and I appreciate you watching.